The 14-year-old princess stands naked while 3 elderly women examine her most intimate parts, checking for the signs of maidenhood that will determine whether her marriage alliance saves or destroys 2 kingdoms. Outside the chamber, a bishop waits with holy water and prayers, ready to bless what happens next. In the adjoining room, witnesses from both families prepare to observe, or at least listen to the consummation, because without their testimony, this marriage doesn't legally exist. The bloodied sheets will be displayed tomorrow from the castle walls, proof that the bride was pure and the marriage is valid. This isn't some barbaric ancient ritual. This is a Christian wedding night in medieval Europe, where the church claimed authority over virginity, nobility demanded public proof of purity, and a young girl's hymen could determine the fate of nations. The priest didn't just bless these inspections, they organised them, supervised them, and used them to control the sexuality of half the population while claiming it was God's will. Chapter 1. The Church's obsession with virgin brides. The medieval Catholic Church's fixation on female virginity went far beyond spiritual concern. It was a systematic mechanism for controlling property, bloodlines, and women's bodies. The theological justification started with Mary, the Virgin Mother of Christ, whose impossible standard of perpetual virginity, even after childbirth, became the template against which all women were measured. But the real power grab came when the Church declared marriage a sacrament in the 12th century, giving priests unprecedented authority over the most intimate aspects of human life. Suddenly, God's representatives on earth weren't just blessing unions, they were determining their validity based on hymens and bloodstains. The theology was tortuously complex. Marriage, according to church doctrine, wasn't complete until physically consummated, but that consummation had to be proper, between a virgin bride and her husband in the missionary position, without excessive pleasure, and open to procreation. Any deviation could invalidate the sacrament. This gave the church enormous leverage. A marriage could be annulled if the bride wasn't a virgin, if consummation didn't occur, if it occurred improperly, or if either party was incapable. The church positioned itself as the ultimate arbiter of what happened in medieval bedrooms, with priests and bishops making rulings about the most intimate physical acts. The Virgin Mary paradox created impossible standards for medieval women. Mary was simultaneously virgin, wife, and mother. 3 states that were mutually exclusive in reality, but had to be spiritually reconciled. Every bride was expected to approach her wedding as Mary approached Joseph, pure, untouched, but ready for sacred motherhood. The church fathers wrote extensively about the intact virgin, whose hymen remained unbroken even in marriage, citing Mary as the example. Some theologians argued that truly holy women could conceive without penetration, as Mary had. This impossible standard meant real women were always falling short, always sinful, always in need of church intervention and forgiveness. Canon law developed elaborate procedures for verifying virginity because the stakes were so high. A non-virgin bride had committed fornication, a mortal sin. But worse, she had committed fraud against her husband, the church, and God. The marriage sacrament required both parties to come to it in a state of grace. A non-virgin bride polluted the sacrament itself. This wasn't just personal sin, it was cosmic disruption. The church claimed that marriages with non-virgin brides were cursed, would produce deformed children, and brought God's wrath upon entire communities. The pressure on young women was crushing. By the 13th century, the church had developed an entire bureaucracy around virginity verification. Episcopal courts handled virginity disputes. Canon lawyers specialised in hymeneal evidence. Theological texts devoted chapters to the signs of true versus false virginity. The Church's obsession went beyond just a wedding night. They claimed the right to inspect any woman whose virginity was questioned, whether for marriage, inheritance, or criminal cases. Rape victims had to prove their prior virginity to have their cases heard. Women entering convents underwent virginity tests. The intact hymen had become the Church's tool for controlling female sexuality entirely. Chapter 2. The inspection rituals. The actual inspection process was a ritualized humiliation designed to assert total control over women's bodies. While popular imagination pictures priests conducting these examinations, the reality was more complex, and in many ways worse. The Church mandated the inspections but had laywomen perform them, usually elderly matrons or midwives considered honest and God-fearing. These women were effectively agents of Church authority, trained in what to look for and how to report it. The priest didn't need to touch the bride himself. He had surrogate hands to do his work while maintaining spiritual distance. The inspection typically began hours before the wedding night. The bride would be taken to a private chamber where the appointed matrons would conduct their examination. She would be stripped completely naked. Modesty was a luxury virginity. Verification didn't allow. The matrons would first conduct a visual inspection, looking for signs of previous childbirth or sexual activity. They checked for stretch marks, examined breast development, and looked for any scarring or unusual marks that might indicate sexual experience. Every part of the young woman's body became evidence to be catalogued and reported. The internal examination was even more invasive. The matrons would insert fingers to check for an intact hymen, though medieval understanding of female anatomy was so poor that what they were actually checking for was often unclear. They believed virgins had a membrane that completely sealed the vaginal opening, which would break and bleed upon first penetration. They didn't understand that hymens vary enormously, that many activities besides sex could tear them, or that some women are born with very little hymenal tissue. The matrons would declare their findings to the priest, who would record whether the bride was intact, corrupted, or questionable. For royal and noble marriages, the inspection could be semi-public. Representatives from both families might be present, along with Church officials, to witness the matron's declaration. The bride stood naked before strangers who discussed her genitals like livestock at market. Some accounts describe brides fainting from shame and fear. Others tell of young women who vomited or lost bladder control from terror. The trauma was considered normal, even beneficial. Suffering purified the soul and prepared the bride for her sacred duty. After the inspection, but before consummation, the priest would bless the marriage bed in an elaborate ceremony. He would sprinkle holy water on the sheets, say prayers over the pillows, and sometimes place religious relics under the mattress. The bed became a sacred space where the marriage sacrament would be physically completed. Some priests insisted on checking the sheets beforehand to ensure they were white and unmarked, ready to receive the virgin blood that would validate the union. The bedroom became a chapel, the bed an altar, and the bride's body the sacrifice that would seal the sacrament. The consummation itself was often witnessed, especially for politically important marriages. Witnesses didn't always watch directly, though sometimes they did, but they would be present in the room or immediately outside. They needed to testify that consummation occurred, that both parties participated willingly, in theory, and that virgin blood was shed. The witnesses might include family members court officials, and church representatives. The couple would perform their marital duty, knowing that people were listening for sounds of completion, waiting to inspect the sheets, ready to verify that the marriage was valid. The morning after brought the final humiliation, displaying the bloodied sheets. The stained linen would be hung from windows, paraded through streets, or presented at court as proof of the bride's virginity and the marriage's validity. The blood pattern was analysed. Too much blood suggested violence, too little suggested non-virginity, and the wrong colour might indicate menstruation rather than broken hymens. Professional sheet inspectors developed expertise in distinguishing virgin blood from other substances. The sheets became legal documents, sometimes preserved in family archives, as proof of legitimate consummation. Chapter 3. When politics entered the bedroom, the intersection of virginity verification and political power reached its apex in royal marriages, where a princess's hymen could determine war or peace, alliance or invasion. The marriage of Isabella of Castile to Ferdinand of Aragon in 1469 demonstrates how virginity became a tool of statecraft. Isabella's virginity was inspected 3 times, once before the betrothal, once before the wedding, and once after consummation. Because the union of Castile and Aragon depended on her being provably pure, the inspections were conducted by committees of matrons from both kingdoms, supervised by bishops and witnessed by nobles who would later testify to her intact state. The bloodied sheets from their wedding night were divided into pieces, with portions sent to the Pope, the King of France, and the Holy Roman Emperor as diplomatic proof that the marriage creating unified Spain was legitimate. The most infamous virginity dispute involved Catherine of Aragon, whose alleged virginity, after her first marriage to Arthur Tudor, became the pivotal point in England's break from Rome. When Arthur died 5 months after their wedding, in 1502, Catherine swore the marriage was never consummated, maintaining her virginity for her second marriage to Arthur's brother, Henry VIII. For 20 years this claim went unchallenged, but when Henry wanted to annul their marriage to marry Anne Boleyn, Catherine's decades-old virginity became an international incident. The Pope commissioned investigators to interview witnesses from that wedding night 30 years prior. Servants were questioned about bloodstains, courtiers about sounds from the bedchamber, and laundresses about the state of the sheets. The political implications were staggering. If Catherine had lied about her virginity, she had committed fraud against the crown and the church, invalidating her marriage to Henry and making their daughter Mary illegitimate. If she told the truth, Henry had no grounds for annulment. The King of Spain, Catherine's nephew, Charles V, threatened war if his aunt was declared a liar. The Pope was caught between the 2 most powerful monarchs in Christendom. The entire English Reformation arguably hinged on whether a teenage princess had bled on her wedding night 3 decades earlier. When the Pope refused to rule against Catherine's virginity claim, Henry broke from Rome entirely, establishing the Anglican Church to grant his own annulment. Margaret of Valois' wedding night to Henry of Navarre in 1572 shows how virginity inspections could be weaponized in religious conflicts. Margaret was Catholic, Henry was Protestant, and their marriage was meant to heal France's religious wars. The virginity inspection became a battleground between faiths. Catholic matrons declared Margaret intact, Protestant inspectors disputed the findings, and a compromise committee of medical doctors was assembled to conduct a 3rd examination. Margaret later wrote that she was examined like a horse at market by 15 different people across 3 days. The inspections were so invasive and politically charged that they contributed to the tensions leading to the St. Bartholomew's Day. massacre just days after the wedding. The Byzantine Empire perfected the political virginity test with the bride show tradition. When an emperor needed a wife, virgins from across the empire would be brought to Constantinople for inspection. The examinations went beyond just virginity. They checked for breast firmness, hip width for childbearing, teeth health, body odour, and any marks that might indicate witchcraft. The process could take months, with hundreds of girls examined naked by imperial physicians and priests. The winner would become empress, but the losers often couldn't return home. Their virginity was now questionable after being in the capital, handled by strangers. Many ended up in convents or brothels, their lives destroyed by an inspection they didn't pass. Chapter 4. The business of proving purity. A thriving industry developed around virginity verification and fakery, creating professional opportunities that ranged from respected medical practice to criminal fraud. Professional virginity inspectors commanded high fees for their services, especially those with reputations for accuracy, though what constituted accuracy in examining something as variable as hymens remains unclear. In major cities like Paris, London, and Rome, certain midwives specialised exclusively in virginity verification, maintaining offices near churches where weddings occurred. They developed tools specifically for examinations, speculums made of polished metal, measuring devices for vaginal opening diameter, and even primitive microscopes for examining blood samples. The economics were substantial. A certified virginity inspection for a noble bride could cost 50 gold florins, more than a skilled craftsman earned in a year. The inspector's seal on a virginity certificate became as important as the priest's blessing on the marriage contract. Some inspectors offered guarantees. If their certification was later disputed, they would refund their fee and pay damages. This created perverse incentives for inspectors to always find what their clients wanted them to find. Noble families would pay extra for certain results, while desperate brides would pay for favourable reports regardless of physical findings. The fake virginity industry was equally sophisticated. Alchemists and apothecaries developed various methods to counterfeit virgin blood and even intact hymens. The most common was a small bladder filled with chicken or pig blood inserted before consummation to ensure bleeding. More elaborate contraptions involved astringent solutions to tighten vaginal muscles, creating resistance that mimicked virginity. Some practitioners claimed they could surgically reconstruct hymens using sheep intestine membranes, a procedure that probably killed more women than it helped. Recipe books from the period include dozens of formulas for maiden's blood, mixtures of various animal bloods, herbs and minerals designed to stain sheets in the correct pattern. The market for these services crossed all social classes. Noble families might employ discreet physicians to ensure their daughter's virginity before important marriages. Merchant families used lower-tier inspectors and cheaper fakery methods. Even peasant brides might scrape together coins for chicken blood or astringent herbs. The church officially condemned virginity fakery as both fraud and sacrilege, but priests often turned blind eyes for sufficient donations. Some convents secretly offered restoration services for fallen women, combining spiritual penance with physical preparations to help them pass as virgins for marriage. Women developed their own networks for navigating the system. Older women would advise brides on how to act during inspections, how much to resist, when to cry, what to say. They shared techniques for ensuring wedding night bleeding, even if the hymen was already broken, scratching with fingernails, small cuts with hidden blades, or rough consummation that would cause tearing. Communities of women protected each other's secrets, creating elaborate deceptions to help non-virgin brides pass their inspections. Midwives might be bribed, matrons might be blackmailed, and priests might be seduced or threatened into cooperation. The inspection fraud could be incredibly elaborate. One documented case from 1487 Florence involved a bride whose family hired actors to play witnesses, forged medical certificates, and even created fake bloodied sheets using a complex mixture of blood, wine, and iron filings that would oxidize to the correct colour by morning. The deception was only discovered years later when the husband found love letters proving his wife had been sexually active before marriage. The resulting trial revealed a network of professional virginity fakers that included doctors, midwives, artists who painted convincing bloodstains, and even priests who provided false blessings. Chapter 5. When inspections failed. The consequences of failing a virginity inspection could range from social death to actual execution, depending on the woman's social status and the political context. Anne of Cleves, fourth wife of Henry VIII, provides a tragic example of how failed consummation, and by extension questionable virginity, could destroy even a queen. When Henry claimed he couldn't consummate their marriage because her body repulsed him, and he doubted her virginity, Anne faced an impossible situation. The king's physicians examined her and declared her intact. But Henry insisted this proved she was malformed or cursed rather than virgin. The marriage was annulled after 6 months, and while Anne escaped with her life, unlike some of Henry's other wives, she was forever marked as the queen too repugnant or impure to bed. For non-noble women, failing virginity inspection meant immediate and irreversible destruction. In 1475, Marseille merchant's daughter, Catherine Bouchard, was found corrupted during her wedding night inspection. Her husband, having paid a substantial dowry for a virgin bride, demanded its return and pressed charges of fraud. Catherine claimed she'd been raped years earlier, but kept silent from shame. The court didn't care about her trauma, only that she had attempted to pass as virgin. She was publicly whipped. Her family was forced to return double the dowry, and she was branded on the forehead with the letter P for putain, whore. Unable to marry or find respectable work with that mark, Catherine eventually became what they had branded her, a prostitute. Her rapist was never investigated. The legal mechanisms for punishing false virgins were extensively codified. The Saxon Spiegel, a German legal code, specified that a bride found non-virgin could be immediately divorced, losing all dowry and inheritance rights. She could be expelled from her family home and stripped of her surname. In some jurisdictions, she could be executed for fraud if the deception involved forged medical certificates or bribed inspectors. The woman's entire family could suffer. Fathers lost political positions, mothers were barred from church activities, and sisters became unmarriageable by association. One failed inspection could destroy an entire family line. Even successful women who passed their inspections lived in constant fear of retrospective challenges. Years or decades after marriage, husbands could claim their wives had faked virginity if they wanted divorces or to delegitimize children. In 1389, Duke Philip of Burgundy claimed his wife Margaret had not been virgin 23 years after their wedding, using this to justify taking a mistress and attempting to legitimize his bastards. Margaret had to undergo humiliating testimony about her wedding night before ecclesiastical courts, with witnesses describing intimate details of decades-old bloodstains. Though the court ultimately sided with Margaret, the trial destroyed her reputation and health. The witch trials of the 15th to 17th centuries weaponized virginity inspection in new ways. Accused witches were routinely subjected to virginity tests, based on the belief that demons preferred to possess non-virgin women. If a woman was found non-virgin but claimed to be, it was evidence of demonic corruption. If she was virgin, it might mean she had made a pact to maintain supernatural purity. The inspections for witch trials were particularly brutal. Investigators looked for devil's marks in intimate areas, used needles to test sensitivity of genitals, and sometimes conducted repeated examinations to see if virginity status mysteriously changed. Thousands of women were tortured and executed, based partly on the state of their hymens. Chapter 6. The system's dark purpose. The virginity inspection system was never really about virginity. It was about controlling women's bodies, labour, and reproductive capacity in service of male property transfer. A virgin daughter was a financial asset that could be traded for alliance, wealth, or status. Her virginity wasn't her own, it belonged to her father until transferred to her husband. The inspection system ensured this property maintained its value. Women's bodies became commodities with quality control standards enforced by church and state. The hymen was essentially a quality seal that guaranteed the product was unopened and functioning as designed. The economic mathematics were explicit. Virgin daughters commanded higher bride prices or dowries because they guaranteed paternity of heirs. A man investing in a wife, through bride price, dowry negotiations or alliance agreements, needed assurance his investment would yield legitimate offspring. The virginity inspection was due diligence, like examining a horse's teeth or testing gold's purity. The church provided theological justification, the state provided legal framework, and medicine provided pseudo-scientific validation, but the core transaction was always economic. Women were livestock whose breeding potential needed verification. This system created intergenerational trauma that shaped European society for centuries. Mothers who had endured traumatic inspections prepared their daughters for the same ordeal, perpetuating cycles of shame and fear around female sexuality. Girls grew up knowing their value depended on an intact hymen, leading to obsessive anxiety about any activity that might damage it. Riding horses, dancing, even laughing too hard were feared as virginity threatening. The psychological damage created generations of women who associated their sexuality with pain, shame, and public scrutiny. This trauma was then passed to their daughters as wisdom about how to survive in a world that valued their hymens more than their humanity. The virginity inspection system also shaped medical practice in ways that persist today. The belief that virginity could be medically verified led to centuries of invasive gynecological practices based on controlling rather than caring for women's bodies. Modern virginity testing, still practiced in some cultures, descends directly from medieval Christian inspection rituals. The myth that hymens prove virginity, thoroughly debunked by medical science, persists because it serves the same purpose it always has: controlling women's sexuality through shame and surveillance. The gradual decline of formal virginity inspections in Western Europe came not from enlightenment, but from changing economic structures. As capitalism replaced feudalism, women's economic value shifted from breeding stock to labour force. Industrial economies needed women in factories, not just bedrooms. The rising middle class couldn't afford elaborate inspection rituals. Protestant reforms emphasised private conscience over public verification. But the underlying beliefs persisted: that women's sexuality needed control, that virginity determined value, that male anxiety about paternity justified female suffering. Modern parallels are uncomfortable but undeniable. Purity balls where daughters pledge virginity to fathers, abstinence-only education that values hymens over health, virginity tests for female police or military recruits in some countries, all descend from medieval inspection rituals. The technology changes, but the impulse remains: to control women's sexuality through surveillance, shame, and the threat of social destruction. The priests may no longer wait outside bedchambers, but the cultural priests of family, medicine, and law still claim authority over women's bodies. The historical record of virginity inspections reveals Christianity's foundational role in creating systematic oppression of female sexuality. This wasn't peripheral to Christian society. It was central to how Christian patriarchy functioned. Every virgin inspection was a ritual of male dominance performed under sacred authority. Every bloodied sheet displayed was a celebration of violence disguised as virtue. Every woman subjected to these inspections was sacrificed to maintain systems that treated her body as property and her suffering as sacred duty. So there it is. The holy men who claim to represent God on earth built an entire system around inspecting, verifying, and commodifying the hymens of teenage girls. They dressed it up in theology, wrapped it in sacrament, and called it sacred. But it was always about control. Control of bloodlines, control of property, control of women's bodies, and ultimately control of society itself through the regulation of who could breed with whom. The priest didn't need to personally examine every bride. They had created something far more insidious, a self-perpetuating system where mothers prepared daughters for trauma, where communities enforced virginity through surveillance, where women internalized their value as residing in a piece of tissue between their legs. The church made everyone complicit in the violation. And before you think this is ancient history, remember that virginity tests are still performed today in at least 20 countries. The World Health Organization has condemned them as human rights violations, yet they continue. The mythology that virginity can be medically verified, a medieval Christian invention, still destroys women's lives from Afghanistan to Zimbabwe. The purity balls, promise rings, and abstinence pledges of modern America are direct descendants of medieval virginity inspections, just with better marketing. We've replaced priests with physicians, bloodied sheets with purity certificates, but the underlying message remains: women's bodies are public property, requiring verification and control. If this story disturbed you, if you need to understand more about how religious institutions have controlled human sexuality throughout history, subscribe now and hit the notification bell. Because every generation thinks it's escaped the medieval mindset, yet we keep finding new ways to police women's bodies, to demand proof of purity, to make the private public for the sake of control. The priests may not be checking brides anymore, but their spiritual descendants are still obsessed with what happens in women's bedrooms. Subscribe now and discover more uncomfortable truths about how power has always used purity as a weapon.